Imagine standing in the middle of a bustling city. Cars zoom past, horns blare, people chatter loudly, and your phone buzzes incessantly with notifications. The world around you is alive, but it's also overwhelmingly noisy, a constant barrage of sound and information pulling at your attention from every direction. This is modern life in all its vibrant chaos. But amid this relentless clamor, a strange thing happens. We start to feel disconnected, not just from others but from ourselves. The noise outside seems to drown out the quiet voice within, that gentle sense of calm, clarity, and presence we all crave but rarely experience. In today's fast-paced world, silence has become a rare commodity, almost like a forgotten art. We fill every moment with sound or distraction, afraid of facing the emptiness that silence can bring. Yet, it's precisely in this silence that many find refuge, a space to breathe, to reflect, and to rediscover what truly matters. The art of silence isn't about muting the world around us. It's about tuning into a deeper stillness within, a place untouched by the chaos of everyday life. It's learning to be present with ourselves and the world in a way that goes beyond noise and distraction. For thousands of years, spiritual traditions, particularly Buddhism, have recognized the power of silence as a path to wisdom and peace. The Buddha himself taught that silence is not just the absence of speech or sound, but a doorway to insight and awakening. In a world where words often lead to misunderstanding and conflict, silence can be the truest form of communication. Yet, how do we reclaim this art of silence today, when every moment seems designed to keep us talking, scrolling, reacting? How can we find stillness amid the digital noise and endless demands on our attention? This journey starts with a simple awareness, noticing the noise, both outside and inside our minds. The relentless chatter of thoughts, worries, and distractions that keep us from being fully present. It's in recognizing this that we open the door to something profoundly transformative. Silence, as strange as it may seem, is not emptiness. It is fullness, a rich, vibrant space where our minds can rest, where insight can arise, and where the heart can open. It is a practice, a skill, an art that invites us to slow down, listen deeply, and live more consciously. In the chapters ahead, we will explore how silence is understood and practiced through the lens of Buddhist wisdom. We will uncover its role beyond simply quieting noise, as a tool for self-awareness, emotional healing, and spiritual growth. We'll look at the challenges modern life presents to cultivating silence, and how mindful practices can help us reclaim it in everyday moments. More than anything, this is an invitation to step away from the constant noise, to explore the depth of stillness within, and to experience the peace that silence can bring, not as an escape, but as a way of truly engaging with life. Because in the end, silence is not about shutting down the world. It's about opening up to it in a whole new way. Silence is not merely the absence of sound. It is a profound state of being that Buddhism has revered for millennia. To truly grasp the art of silence, we must turn to these ancient teachings, where silence is more than just quietness. It's a pathway to awakening. In the bustling rhythm of our modern world, words flow endlessly, texts, tweets, conversations, and media flooding our minds. But Buddhism teaches us that every word carries weight. The Buddha's principle of right speech, one of the Noble Eightfold Path's pillars, reminds us that how we speak shapes our experience of the world. Words can heal or harm, create peace or stir conflict. Silence then becomes a deliberate choice, a practice of restraint, wisdom, and compassion. It's about knowing when to speak and when to hold back, when to engage and when to simply listen. In this way, silence is not emptiness but a mindful presence, a sacred space where our words emerge from clarity rather than chaos. Beyond speech, Buddhist teachings invite us to cultivate an inner silence, a stillness of the mind where distractions dissolve. This silent mind is not a blank slate but a fertile ground for insight. Meditation practices like Vipassana, or insight meditation, guide us toward this quiet awareness, encouraging us to observe thoughts and sensations without attachment or judgment. In that stillness, the chatter of the mind slows and clarity dawns. We begin to see the impermanence of thoughts, the illusion of a fixed self, and the interconnectedness of all beings. Silence reveals the nature of reality in a way words never can. The Buddha himself often retreated into solitude, embracing silence as a teacher. His followers learned that true understanding arises not from endless debate but from direct experience, found in the quiet moments of reflection and meditation. This inner silence also helps us cultivate compassion. When the mind is calm and clear, we can better hear the suffering of others, not just through their words, but through the unspoken pains and joys that connect us all. Silence becomes a bridge, a way to hold space for others without rushing to fix or judge. And yet, this silence is not about withdrawal or isolation. It is a dynamic, living silence that flows through our actions, speech, and relationships. It is the foundation for wisdom, the ability to respond to life with clarity and kindness instead of reaction and confusion. As we continue, we will explore how this Buddhist foundation of silence offers more than spiritual solace. It provides practical tools to navigate the noise and distraction of modern life. It teaches us how to cultivate stillness within, even as the world swirls around us, helping us live with greater presence, peace, and purpose. Silence, rooted in mindfulness and compassion, becomes not an escape, but a profound engagement with life itself. When we hear the word silence, our minds often jump to the absence of noise, a quiet room, a muted phone, a calm morning without traffic. But silence is far richer than mere soundlessness. It is a profound experience that unfolds within, a dimension of stillness that transcends what our ears can detect. In Buddhist philosophy, silence is not simply the lack of external sound. It is the quieting of the internal dialogue, the endless stream of thoughts, judgments, and distractions that clutter our minds. Imagine sitting by a lake at dawn, watching the water smooth and undisturbed. That stillness on the surface is what silence looks like inside the mind. Yet, not all silence is equal. There is a difference between what we might call active silence and passive silence. Passive silence might be the silence of avoidance, when we shut down, withdraw, or suppress our feelings and thoughts to escape discomfort. It's a silence born of fear or resistance, not peace. This kind of silence, while outwardly quiet, can feel heavy and tense, like a storm brewing beneath a calm sky. Active silence, on the other hand, is a deliberate, conscious choice. It's the silence of presence, awareness, and openness. It allows space for insight, for creativity to emerge, for the heart to soften. This silence is alive. It's a fertile pause, not a void. When we cultivate active silence, we begin to notice the subtle rhythms within us, the rise and fall of the breath, the beat of the heart, the gentle whisper of sensations. This internal silence becomes a gateway to mindfulness, the practice of being fully present in the moment without judgment. In this space, the mind is not blank or numb. It is alert, clear, and receptive. Thoughts may come and go like clouds drifting across the sky, but they no longer pull us into their drama. We watch them with gentle curiosity, letting them pass without grasping or pushing away. This kind of silence reveals a deeper truth, that the noise we often chase or fear is a distraction from the richness of simply being. Behind the chatter of the mind, behind the noise of the world, there is a calm, steady presence, always available, always here. Learning to dwell in this silence is one of the greatest gifts of Buddhist practice. It teaches us patience with ourselves and the world, a compassion born from understanding rather than reaction. In the midst of our busy lives, cultivating this inner silence can feel like finding an oasis in the desert, a space where we can refresh, reset, and reconnect with our true nature. But how do we nurture this silence when the world around us is so loud? How do we move beyond merely stopping sound to entering this profound stillness within? That's the question we'll explore next, as we dive deeper into the realities of our noisy modern world and how it challenges us to reclaim the art of silence, not just as an idea, but as a lived experience. In every moment, we are surrounded by noise, not just the obvious sounds, the traffic, the chatter, the hum of machines, but a deeper, more pervasive noise that invades our minds and hearts. The modern world is louder than ever before. Technology, with all its gifts, has also brought an incessant stream of information and distraction. Notifications ping endlessly on our phones. Social media floods us with opinions, images, and updates, demanding our attention, triggering emotions, and fragmenting our focus. We live in a world where silence feels almost suspicious, as if we must always be on, connected, responding. This constant stimulation rewires our brains. Neuroscience tells us that the bombardment of digital noise affects our ability to concentrate, to reflect, and to rest. We become scattered, anxious, overwhelmed, a condition some call attention poverty. Our minds are pulled in 1,000 directions at once, and the space for silence shrinks. But it's not only technology. The culture around us often equates busyness with success and noise with vitality. Being silent or still can be mistaken for weakness, boredom, or loneliness. We fill gaps in conversation with filler words or distractions, uncomfortable with pauses or quiet moments. This relentless noise creates what Buddhist teachings describe as dukkha, a deep dissatisfaction and suffering rooted in craving and attachment. We crave stimulation to avoid feeling emptiness or discomfort. Yet this craving only deepens our restlessness. Ironically, in trying to escape silence, we lose touch with the very thing that could bring peace. The noise masks the inner voice that calls us back to balance. It drowns out our intuition, our wisdom, and our compassion. We become strangers to ourselves, caught in cycles of distraction and reaction. Yet this noisy landscape also presents an invitation, a challenge to reclaim silence as an act of resistance and renewal, to choose moments of stillness amid the chaos, to create sacred spaces where the mind can rest and the heart can open. Buddhist teachings offer practical tools for this. The practice of mindfulness reminds us to notice when noise pulls us away and to gently return to the present. Meditation teaches us how to cultivate mental silence, even in a noisy world. Compassion practices help us soften the inner turmoil caused by external distractions. More importantly, these teachings encourage us to shift our relationship with noise itself. Instead of fighting it, we learn to observe it without judgment, recognizing its impermanence and learning not to be swept away by it. The noise of modern life is real and challenging, but it need not define us. In the next chapter, we will explore concrete ways to cultivate silence in our daily lives, how to transform moments, no matter how brief, into gateways of stillness and insight. Because even in the busiest world, the art of silence is within reach. Silence is not something that happens to us. It is something we practice, cultivate, and embody. Like any art, it requires patience, dedication, and intention. It is not the absence of noise alone, but the presence of mindful awareness that transforms silence into a living experience. In Buddhism, the practice of silence is woven deeply into the fabric of daily life and meditation. It begins with simple acts, pausing before speaking, listening fully without interrupting, and allowing moments of quiet to arise naturally. These small choices build a foundation for deeper silence within. But practicing silence goes beyond external stillness. It means learning to quiet the restless mind. Thoughts, emotions, and judgments can be louder than any external noise. The real challenge lies in observing these inner disturbances without becoming entangled in them. Meditation is the doorway. Through sitting quietly, focusing on the breath, or simply observing the present moment, we create space inside. This space is a sanctuary from the noise, a refuge where clarity and peace can grow. Yet silence in practice is never about forcing the mind into emptiness. It is about meeting whatever arises, thoughts, feelings, sensations, with gentle curiosity and acceptance. We learn not to push away distractions, but to watch them as clouds passing across the sky, knowing they come and go. Another vital element is mindful speech. Silence is not about withholding communication, but about speaking with intention and kindness. The Buddha's teachings on right speech remind us to speak truthfully, helpfully, and at the right time. Sometimes, the greatest wisdom is found in choosing silence over words. Incorporating silence into daily life can take many forms. A few minutes of mindful breathing before starting a task, a silent walk in nature, turning off devices for a designated period, or simply savoring quiet moments between conversations. These practices create ripples beyond the individual. When we cultivate silence, we also cultivate presence that allows us to connect deeply with others, to listen with empathy, and to respond with compassion. Silence, then, is not isolation. It is a bridge to connection, both inward and outward. It grounds us in our true selves and opens our hearts to the world. As we practice, silence becomes a refuge and a wellspring of strength. It teaches us resilience in the face of chaos and the grace to move through life with calm and clarity. The art of practicing silence is a journey, not a destination. Each moment of stillness brings us closer to the essence of who we are, a being of peace, wisdom, and compassion. Next, we will explore how silence can transform our relationships and deepen our understanding of connection in a noisy world. In the cacophony of modern life, true listening has become a rare and precious gift. Most of us are quick to speak, to respond, to fill the silence with our own words. Yet in Buddhist wisdom, silence holds the key to deeper connection, not just with ourselves but with others. Listening is often misunderstood as merely hearing sounds or waiting for our turn to talk. But authentic listening requires a kind of silence, a stillness within that open space for another's voice to be fully heard and honored. When we practice this kind of listening, silence becomes a powerful presence. It invites the other person to express their truth without interruption or judgment. In these moments, silence is not empty. It is alive with attention and compassion. This mindful silence in relationships helps dissolve barriers. It creates trust, understanding, and empathy. It allows us to see beyond words to the feelings and needs beneath. In this way, silence becomes a bridge, transforming communication into connection. On the other hand, silence can sometimes be misunderstood or feared in relationships as a sign of distance, conflict, or neglect. But the silence we cultivate through mindful practice is different. It is a presence that supports and nurtures, not one that isolates. In Buddhist teachings, this power of silence extends beyond personal relationships. It is the foundation for right speech and harmonious communities. When we learn to listen deeply, we also learn to speak wisely and kindly. The practice of silence in relationship invites us to slow down, to be fully present, and to honor the sacredness of each encounter. It teaches us patience and humility, recognizing that sometimes the most healing thing we can offer is simply to be there, quietly and fully. In a world where noise often drowns out understanding, cultivating this art of silent listening is a radical act of love. As we move toward the close of our exploration, the final chapter will invite us to embrace silence not only as a practice, but as a way of being, integrating its wisdom into every aspect of our lives. As our journey through the art of silence comes to a close, we arrive at a simple yet profound truth. Silence is not just an occasional retreat, but a way of life. It is an invitation to slow down, to come home to ourselves, and to find peace amidst the swirling noise of the world. Inviting silence into daily life does not mean withdrawing from the world or avoiding challenges. Rather, it means carrying a silent presence within, an inner calm that grounds us no matter what arises. It means responding to life's demands with mindfulness instead of reaction, with clarity instead of confusion. Start small. Begin with a moment of stillness in the morning before the day's rush begins. Breathe deeply. Listen to the quiet that is always there beneath the surface. Throughout the day, pause and check in with yourself. Notice the spaces between your thoughts. Embrace moments of silence as gifts, not voids. As you practice, you'll discover silence is a source of creativity, wisdom, and healing. It helps you reconnect with your values, your purpose, and your true nature. It deepens your compassion for yourself and others. Remember, silence is also a form of resistance against the noise that pulls us apart. By choosing silence, we reclaim our attention and power. We create space for what truly matters. If this journey into the art of silence has resonated with you, I invite you to take these teachings beyond today. Practice regularly, share your experiences, and notice how your life transforms. And if you found value in this video, please like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your engagement helps us bring more meaningful content to this community. Share this video with someone who might also benefit from the gift of silence. Together, let's cultivate a world where silence is treasured, a world where peace, clarity, and compassion flourish. Thank you for listening. Until next time, may your days be filled with stillness and your heart with quiet joy.